Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's lesson. I have three things I want to do today. The first thing is I want to talk about the survey that I posted as an assignment. I think it was Thursday that I posted that. That talked about those two terms, liberal versus conservative. And this deals with the government, so we're wrapping up our government unit here. And this is something I wanted to talk about before we finished with government. And also, I wanted to answer some of the questions that were posted about the 10 Amendments, the Bill of Rights. We're going to try to answer those questions. And then we're going to move on to our new unit, because we are going to be moving forward with Unit 7. And we need to get through Unit 8, which is slavery and the Civil War, before the end of the school year. So the actual lesson itself is not going to take place in this video for a few minutes. We're just going to start with these terms here: Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. These are terms that, unless you truly live under a rock or never do anything on a device other than watch a video game, somewhere along the lines, I'm sure that you've heard of these terms. So I wanted you to know what they are, because they're grown-up terms, and even though they might not seem really relevant or important to your life now, eventually they're going to be, because eventually you guys are all going to be grown-ups. And certainly this is grown-up stuff. So let's start with the term Democrat and Republican. And we talked about political parties several lessons back. So that's just something we need to refresh here. A political party is not really technically part of the government. It's like a private club, really, but anybody can join it. And the purpose of political parties is you are kind of coming together, you're joining together with people who have similar ideas as you do, and your purpose is to get somebody elected to the government who's going to carry out your ideas. So if someone identifies themselves as a Democrat, it means that they share a lot of ideas in common about how the government should be run with other Democrats. Or a person might identify themselves as a Republican. Maybe they went out and joined the Republican Party. Why not? It's free if you want to. And that means that they share similar ideas with other people who identify themselves as Republicans. But of course, there's a lot of us who don't identify with either political party. You could ask your parents if they are a member of a political party, and I would probably say most Americans are not registered members of any political party. They're what we call independents, although there are probably a lot of people out there who say, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, but whether or not they actually joined the Democratic Party or Republican Party is a different question. So what's a Democrat? What's a Republican? What's the difference between the two? What are the differences in their ideas? Well, this really comes down to these other terms here: liberal versus conservative. And that is why I asked you to take this survey, because by taking the survey, you yourself can determine whether or not you are a liberal or a conservative, or at least which way you tend to go. So what I asked you to do was choose one statement in each of the boxes. And although you might not agree 100% with any of the statements, you should have picked the one that you most agree with. And then I asked you to remember that number. So for example, for that first box there, 1, since rich people make more money, they should pay more taxes. Or 2, it's important to not tax business owners and the rich too much, because they will not be able to use their money to create more businesses and jobs for the poor. Or maybe you believed 3, people should keep the money they earn. Rich people shouldn't have to pay higher taxes just because they're good at what they do. There's a word for that. It's stealing. So let's say that you chose 3. You really believe that people should keep the money that they earn, and that you shouldn't just raise taxes on someone because they're successful. And let's say for the second box that you also chose 3. You decided in your mind, if people are poor, it's their problem. Poor people know, if poor people know they can get money for free from the government, then they won't have any reason to go out and find a job for themselves. That's a pretty extreme statement, but if you believed that, and you believed the third statement in the first box, then you add those together and you're up to 6, and so on and so forth. And you would end up with a score at the end of this survey. Now, what you do with that score is you can then plot where you are on this continuum here based on how you scored on that survey. So if you picked all of the ones, those are what we would say are liberal statements. If you picked twos and threes, those are what we would call conservative statements or conservative ideas. So let me get my cursor here, my pointer. So if the lowest you could score on that survey was an 11, if you were an 11, you're like probably over here on the political spectrum. You're very liberal to the point where you may even be leaning towards what we call socialism, which I'm not going to get into that now. This is really 8th grade or even 9th or 10th grade stuff. But if you scored low on that survey, you can look at the statements that you chose. The ones are all what we would call very liberal statements. All right, liberalism is just it's a group of ideas about how society should work and how the government should work. If you were high on that survey, let's say maybe 18, 19, 20, or even higher, then you lean toward what we would say you would be a conservative. Your ideas about politics and society are very conservative. Now, many of us, of course, are in the middle. And if you're like me, you found yourself circling some ones and also circling some twos or even some threes. And that's true of most people, which is really, for me, it's the frustrating thing about politics. And it's why I don't identify with either political party, because some of those ideas I'm over here. Many of those ideas I'm over here. Some people are simply in the center. You know, they're a little bit back and forth between liberal, conservative, liberal, conservative. But if for the most part you believe in liberal ideas, then you are probably identifying with the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is a party that traditionally they have been very liberal in their political ideas and political beliefs. And if you elect a liberal candidate to government, you would expect that they would be implementing some of those ideas. If you were leaning towards the conservative end of the spectrum, then if you had to pick a political party or if you had to vote for a political candidate, you would probably be choosing the Republican candidate, because Republicans tend to be rather conservative in their perspective. So that's what that term liberal versus conservative means. It's a little hard for me to explain. I think the easiest way to explain it is simply to take that survey and look at those statements that are numbered 1, because those are liberal, and look at the statements that are 2, or especially 3. Some of those 3 statements were pretty extreme. If you're circling the 3 statements, then you're probably almost over here. Although I'm not sure, this is one part of this graphic here that I just scooped this off of Google. I'm not sure I agree that authoritarianism is really the opposite of socialism. Certainly liberalism is the opposite of conservatism. I'm not sure. I would almost question that, like maybe that should be libertarianism, but I'm not an expert. And I don't need you to understand these other terms down here, but you can see at the top that the general trend when you go to what we say the left, because that's another way to describe people's political ideas. If you're liberal, you are leaning towards the left, or some people would even say you're a leftist, or you're very left-ish in your political ideas. Actually, I've never heard anyone say you're leftish, but you sometimes hear people say, oh, you lean towards the left. Well, people who lean towards the left believe more in equality in society, according to this graphic here. And people who lean towards the right, according to this graphic, believe in control of society. That's also, I don't know if I agree with that part of this graphic, because actually, I don't want you to misunderstand what they're saying here about equality in society. If you get all the way to the left, we think of equality as being something good. Well, not if equality looks like this. Everybody makes the same amount of money. No matter what you do, no matter whether you work or don't work, or whether you work hard or don't work hard, the government pays you the same amount, and it's not much. That's really what communism looks like. Control of society, fascism, that's certainly what fascism means. But again, I'm not sure that that's really the opposite of liberalism, but I'm not an expert. I do know, jumping ahead here, that some really smart people put together this, and you can go to that website, which is listed on the bottom of that liberal conservative survey I gave you. And the people of this website say, look, it's not a straight line because you're really talking about two different things. People's ideas about the economy, whether the government should control the economy or whether people should be free to make as much money as they want. That's left versus right. But there's also an up versus down here. Should the government have total control of society and tell you what to do? Or should you be free, as libertarians believe, to pretty much do whatever you want and the government should leave you alone? So if you ever felt the need to, you could go to that website that is on the bottom of that survey, and it'll ask you a whole bunch of questions, and then it will plot you here on this sort of political, they call it a political compass. All right, so it's probably more than you ever wanted to know, but I at least wanted you to know a little bit. I wanted you to understand what the term libertarian liberal and conservative mean, and how that relates to the Democratic Party, which actually, I'm going to go back here. I want to say one more thing without getting political. The Democratic Party is liberal, but some people in the Democratic Party have really been moving over here further and further over to the left. And I would say some people in the Republican Party have been moving over and over to the left. And it's getting really hard, if you haven't noticed. Anyone who watches the news has probably noticed. It's getting really hard for people involved in politics to get along these days, because it just seems that people are going more and more to the left and other people are going more and more to the right. And if I was going to give my opinion here, it would be we really need to find a better way to locate the center in this country so that we can get along. Now we're going to move on to the questions that you guys posted about the amendments. I'm going to try to answer as many as I can. I divided them into 3 different slides here, kind of lumped them into different categories. And the first category here is just sort of overall questions about the amendments. Why were they not included in the original Constitution? We're talking the Bill of Rights here. Seems kind of strange they didn't. But I guess the attitude back then was the states already had their own constitutions, and most of the states had their own Bill of Rights. So I guess they just thought it wasn't necessary because the state governments were sort of already protecting people's rights. So tough call on that. Since they added the 10 amendments, it was clear that it's kind of like admitting they should have included them. But it wasn't that they didn't want to give people rights. It was just they expected the state governments to have already done that. Okay, would you ever be able to add or change amendments? Well, you know the answer to that. You add amendments by making amendments, and there's a process we saw in our first video in that series. It's not easy. You got to get 3/4 of all the states to agree to it. But the second part of that question is a good one. Can you change an amendment? Yeah, turns out you can. It takes another amendment to do it, and that's been done once. The 18th Amendment was an amendment that made alcohol illegal in America. That was in 1920. And they spent about 13 years of trying to deal with all the smuggling and the illegal drinking and all the crime that came with that. And they finally threw up their hands and said that was a bad idea. And in 1934, I believe, 33 or 34, they passed the 21st Amendment, which simply got rid of the 18th Amendment. So yes, you can change an amendment. You just got to pass another one to change it. Is there a maximum amount of amendments? Nope. They could go on forever. But since we only have 27 in 240-ish years of history, probably not even going to hit 100. So no, there's no maximum. Why don't some of the amendments apply to school? Well, I hope I wasn't misleading people with some of those court cases that you read. It's not that the amendments don't apply to school. It's just sometimes they apply in a slightly different way. And we saw that with the Tinker case, where yes, there's freedom of speech, just like in the real world. In school, you have freedom of speech, but with limitations. In the real world, if your speech becomes dangerous to others, then you don't have that freedom anymore. In school, if your speech becomes disruptive of instruction, then you don't have that freedom in school. And as we saw with like the TLO case, where the girl's locker was searched, That ruling actually supported the Fourth Amendment by saying that the school officials needed to have a reasonable suspicion to search her private stuff. A few other court cases that I did not assign to you that involve schools. You're not going to like this one. 1977, the Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment. There was a kid who got spanked. It was like an eighth grader. Can you imagine that? An eighth grader was being disruptive during an assembly, and they hauled him out, and the principal had somebody hold him down and spanked him, and the kid sued the school district and said that was cruel punishment. And guess what? The Supreme Court said, nope, you can spank a kid if you want to. It all depends on the school itself and their policy and their rules. If the school allows it, then that's not cruel punishment. There was another court case involving religious activity in schools where they kind of made the same ruling that they have with the government as a whole, that the school cannot officially sponsor religious activity. They have to have a separation of church and state, or in this case, separation of church and school. Doesn't mean you can't have a religious club in school, but you can't have the school make everybody stand up and say a prayer. So these amendments do apply to school, just sometimes in a slightly different way because, hey, you're kids, so you're still under the supervision of adults. All right, continuing here, got a lot of good questions here. Why would they keep the law, the Miranda law? Why wouldn't they change it even though it was named after him? Well, the Miranda law isn't really a law. It's just a policy, as I understand it, that police departments have. That you better read people their rights, because if you don't, there's no point in arresting them because they're going to end up getting off. They're going to be found not guilty if you don't. So that's not really an official law. It's just those rights within the Fifth and the Sixth Amendment have been nicknamed the Miranda law. What happens if you don't go to jury duty? Well, you're going to get in trouble. It's called contempt of court. Contempt of court it's like a minor crime. From what I read, I did a little bit of research on this one. You look at maybe $1,000 fine, maybe 5 days in jail if you really make the judge mad. So why avoid it, right? Nobody wants to go to jail even for 5 days. What if they claim someone as guilty, but then they end up being not guilty? Okay, so if someone is found guilty, but proof is found that they're not guilty, they can ask for another trial, and then in a perfect world, they would get off. They would be found not guilty. What if none of the amendments never existed? How would the police, how would cops treat people, the police? What would happen? Hard to say, but there are countries in the world where these rights don't exist, and the government, in a lot of cases, is not very nice to their citizens. There's an old saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And no matter how nice you start out, if someone gives you total power, like if you give the government total power over their citizens, chances are they're going to abuse it. So thankfully, we have these rights where if the police are abusing their power, you can always go back to the Constitution and have your day in court. If you're not guilty, but you really did do it, what would happen? Wait a minute. If you're not guilty. Okay, so I'm assuming this means if you're found not guilty, but you really did do it. Hey, there's a guy named O.J. Simpson. You may have heard of him. He was a running back for the Buffalo Bills way back in, I guess, the 70s or so. 70s, maybe early 80s. And he was put on trial because his ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend showed up dead. They were murdered in a very gruesome manner. And they put Mr. Simpson on trial, and he was found not guilty. He got out of jail, or he got off in that trial, and then he tried to publish a book. And the name of the book was If I Did It. Yeah. In my mind, I followed that trial. I do think he was guilty. And the court sort of agreed, because what happened is his ex-girlfriend's parents sued him. Okay, so you can go to trial in a criminal court for committing a crime. But remember, you can also be sued in a civil court for causing damage to someone. And the woman's family sued him for wrongful death. They said, you were responsible for our daughter's death. It cost us money, and we want money from you. And he was found guilty in that trial. So don't be so quick to admit your guilt if you're found not guilty. You might not be sent back to jail, but there could be other consequences. Why do you get a second trial if you're found guilty? You don't always get a second trial. Only if you or your lawyers can prove that there was a problem with your first trial or that your rights were not respected. In that case, they will allow you to have a second trial. That next one, I didn't understand what that STER, that was a typo, so I can't answer that one. If you say I plead the fifth, can't they just use that as evidence? Well, they can't use it as evidence, but you do have to be careful because when you plead the fifth, you're basically saying I did something wrong and I'm going to get in trouble for it if I talk, so I'm not talking. So it does kind of make you look guilty, but it can't be used as evidence against you. All right, one of my favorite questions here. If for some reason you brought your own locker to school, can they search it? It's your locker. Well, remember that court case where I mentioned that the locker is actually the school's property, so they can open that locker at any time. I guess this would mean that you're bringing a smaller locker and putting it in the school locker. I I love the thinking behind that one. I feel like maybe I'm training you guys to break the law. But I guess in this case, that would end up being the same as a book bag, right? So if they want to search the locker that you brought to school and put in your locker, then they're still going to have reasonable suspicion according to the TLO Supreme Court case. All right, moving on. Is there ever a time that speech could be limited? Go back and watch the first video and I'll explain it. Why would they let people keep weapons knowing how dangerous people can be? Because there's dangerous people out there, and so some people want to have weapons to protect themselves against the dangerous people. That's one answer to that question. Why don't they just change the amendments like the gun one if it doesn't really need to be a thing anymore? Well, this is the debate, right? This is what people disagree about. And I'll tell you personally, I do own guns, and I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. However, I think that people take things too far. You know, some of the weapons that people are carrying around are really kind of getting out of control. But I guess the answer to that one is it depends on your point of view, because there are people out there like myself who responsibly own guns. I have coyotes on my property and I have little kids, and you know, the police where I live are not just a phone call away, they're at least 20 minutes away. So I personally would like to keep my gun for protection, but I understand that some people are opposed to that idea of others walking around with weapons. And you know what I say to those people is, it just boils down to this: change it. Okay, so in this country, when we can get 3/4 of all the people and all the states to agree that we don't want guns anymore, they will change the Constitution and there will not be guns anymore. And the final question, I know you all been waiting for this one. When we're done learning all the amendments, will we be taking one big test on them? The answer is no. So I decided to cancel the test for this government unit. There will be no test for the government unit. There were a few reasons for that. First of all, I thought it'd be a little unfair because some of that information on the test, a lot of it would actually be from before school closed. It would be a little difficult to review. And I used up a lot of time over the past few weeks going over the amendments, which I felt were really important for you to know your rights. If we had been in school, that would have taken 3 days. It took us over 3 weeks, but I think it was time well spent. But we do need to move on because there's a couple units that we need to get to before the end of the school year. Now, for our next 2 units, we're not going to be worried about a lot of detail. I'll be explaining some things as we go along, but as long as you can focus and understand these 3 big themes that you see on the screen, then that's going to put you in good shape entering next school year, which is really our goal at this point, to get you ready to move on to 8th grade, because the 8th grade curriculum picks up right at the Civil War, toward the end of the Civil War. So we need to get to the Civil War this year. But again, we're not going to worry about a ton of detail because remember, there's no final exam for social studies. We're just looking for participation and learning. So these 3 themes are Americans moved west, slavery divided us, and reformers made a change. Those are the themes I'm going to keep referring back to. And the time period we're talking about is the late 1700s right up until the 1860s, which is when the Civil War broke out. And during this time period, America grew. It grew in size. Americans gained a lot of land. They started to move west onto that new land. And as they did, this argument over slavery really starts to break America apart because more and more people are coming out against slavery in the North. And in the South, the number of slave states is starting to increase. And it just leads to this huge argument that really blows up when this group of people called the reformers or the abolitionists step in, and they really push this question of slavery to a head. They really force people to answer the question, are you for slavery or are you against slavery? And that term reformer simply means people who are trying to make a positive change. The abolitionists were reformers who are trying to make the positive change of ending slavery. And that is going to lead to the Civil War, which ultimately that's why slavery ends in America, because we have this huge, devastating war between the North and the South. It ends up killing 600,000 people, but it does free the slaves. So that's where we want to get to by the end of the year. And we're going to start by jumping into our next unit, Unit 7. Here is the unit packet for Unit 7. I will post it so that if possible, you can print it. If you want to print it, if you have the ability to do that at home, print it. You can take notes on it. That's great. I'll settle for people tuning into the videos and paying attention, but this packet is the roadmap that I typically follow when I'm teaching the unit. So I'm going to have you take a minute and read through the questions and the key concepts, and then I'm going to ask you a couple questions about that. Okay. Now I asked you to read Growing Pains, our next core reading, prior to watching this video. So I'm going to assume that you've done that. If you have not read the Growing Pains reading, then I'd like you to stop the video here, go back, read it. The highlighting questions are optional because I'm not collecting them. I think they're useful, but they're optional. And once you're completed with that, once you're done reading it, you can come back to this part of the video. So I'm going to go over the notes for that reading. Now I want you to think about the title of that reading and picture that America in 1789 with this new constitution is it's like a kid, and they're beginning to grow, and with that growth comes changes in the late 1700s and early 1800s. At the end of the revolution, they get this big growth spurt. They win all this land from England during the American Revolutionary War. They get the land from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River. Let's check out a map for that. I'm going to have you look at the map, answer a couple questions, and I'll be back in a minute. A few things I want you to notice with this map is it doesn't show it, but the Appalachian Mountains run along this line here. And that line used to be called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Grabbing my pointer. I don't know if you noticed that down in the corner there. That's something from way back, December probably, we talked about the Proclamation 1763. It was the first thing that the English did that stirred up trouble between the Americans and the British. And this land that they gained, that the Americans gained at the end of the Revolution, look at what river flows through it. The Ohio River. You might remember the Ohio River Valley. That's where the French and Indian War started. This was all the land that the Americans hoped to win in the French and Indian War. And then they were shut out by the British and told, no, you can't move there. So very fitting that we win that land. We get that land from England at the end of the at the end of the American Revolution. And it's a big chunk of land. It more than doubles the size of America. Of course, it's a lot of wilderness, but it's also the home to a lot of Indians, a lot of Native Americans that the new Americans, the citizens of the United States of America, are going to have to deal with these Indians as they move westward and take this land over and try to claim it as their own. Another growth spurt for America happens a few years later in 1803 with this chunk of land called the Louisiana Purchase. We'll see it on a map in a minute, which again doubles the size of the United States. It stretches from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains. It costs us about $15 million. That sounds like a lot of money, but it was actually just a few pennies an acre. An acre of land in Greece today, in the town of Greece, would cost you thousands of dollars. This was just a few pennies an acre. Let's check out the map. Wow, here's the United States, right? Here's the new United States, just adding on this gigantic chunk of land. But once again, this land, mostly wilderness, but populated by many different Native American groups that the Americans are going to have to deal with. And one of the first things they do, President Thomas Jefferson is actually president at the time. He's the one who makes this deal and buys this land. And one of the first things he does is he sends 2 explorers with a group of men out west to explore this Louisiana territory. Look at the voyage they make. This is an 8,000-mile voyage over the course of, I believe it was about 2.5 years. And they take a boat with them, and part of this voyage is on a river, but the voyage west, they're either pushing the boat or they're carrying the boat. On the way back home, they get to float downstream, but what a voyage they make. And it was, again, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, helped by one Native American who they meet along the way. You may have heard of her, Sacagawea, very famous Native American that helped Lewis and Clark navigate their way all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Because look, they've left the United States. They went so far, they actually left the borders of the United States, went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and made it back alive. I think they only had one person die on the voyage. And maybe you've seen this before on some of these coins. So the new, I call them new, they're not new anymore actually. This goes back to about 2003. They changed the back of the nickel. They have these commemorative nickels. Right here is one showing the Louisiana Purchase. Another one on the back here is the boat that the Lewis and Clark expedition used to travel west. And the Louisiana Quarter shows the Louisiana Territory. Now, I do want you to look closely at the screen. Right here, that's the state of Louisiana. The territory of Louisiana, that's something different. It's obviously much bigger. Eventually, they're going to carve up this territory into a bunch of little states. One of those states will be named after the territory, Louisiana. But I remember as a kid always being confused by this in school. I'm like, wait a minute, I thought Louisiana was a state, but it looks so big on the map. Well, that's because they named it Louisiana first, but then they carved out this little state of Louisiana later. Now, this symbol here, you see the hand shaking. I was talking about Native Americans a few minutes ago. When Lewis and Clark were sent west by Thomas Jefferson, he gave them these medals. This one here is, I don't know if that's an actual medal. I mean, these are hard to come by. These were given to Lewis and Clark to pass out to the Indians as a sign of friendship as they traveled westward, because they were told, make friends with these people. We're going to have to deal with them in the future. So let's not make enemies. Let's make friends. And that's how it was, at least in the beginning. Next up, I'm going to have you look at a couple documents and answer some questions, and then we'll discuss the documents and see how it relates to this theme of Americans moving west. First of all, we have 2 maps. The first map, American population density, 1820. I want you to compare that map to American population density, 1860. There's a legend or a key on each map, which is hard to read. So what I've done is I've posted a much bigger version here on the right so that you can see what the colors on the map mean. So please take a close look at this map. It might be useful to pause the video here before you reach the Edpuzzle questions, because when you hit the Edpuzzle questions, I know from my own experience, it makes the screen a little bit smaller. You might want to pause here and look at the maps. And also, of course, you should be going full screen as you're looking at these documents in this slide and also some of the upcoming slides. Let's look at these maps here. And of course, the first thing you want to do whenever you're looking at a map or document is look at the title. So let's check the title out. We got American population density. Density, isn't that a science term? Well, hey, I guess it can apply to people too. So density would be the amount of people in a given space. And in this case, we're talking about the amount of people within 1 square mile. So on this map, it shows us that in 1820, for most of the United States, or at least the far western half of the United States, there were less than 2 people per mile. That's no neighbors, I'm telling you. That is just you and your dog, or more likely you and your horse. Or realistically, it's maybe you and your family, but no one else for miles and miles. Now, the purple is 2 to 17 people per mile. That is still, that's like living in the country, right? That's very few neighbors. That is not towns. That is not cities. That is still pretty much wilderness. 18 to 90, well, those are areas where there are some small towns. 90 people within a square mile would be like a small village, maybe a small town. And then, of course, the 90 plus, that's your big population centers, your cities. Although I have a feeling that if we travel back in time and looked at cities in 1820, they would just look like big towns today or big villages. But here, and here, located on the eastern seaboard of the United States, only in areas where there was access to trade. Now, this looks like possibly the New York City area. This is not quite Boston. I think it's supposed to be Boston, but it's a little bit out of place. And that's the only location on this map that I can see where there were more than 90 people per square mile. So America at this time is not, it's not a nation of cities. It's a nation of mostly farmers and very small cities, mostly more commonly towns and villages. Now you compare that to 1860 and wow, the difference is obvious, right? Lots of yellow, lots of red in comparison to 1820, which means the density, the amount of people in the United States is growing. And most importantly here is you can see that the areas of red, yes, they've increased, but they've increased in areas away from the Atlantic Ocean. So people are moving inland. And what really, if you're really sharp, what you might have noticed here is almost all of these areas of red, they're still located on bodies of water, on lakes, or this is the Ohio River here. And that's still the Ohio. We've got the Mississippi River here. So the population centers, the big towns or small cities are still popping up mostly along water routes because that was the main form of transportation back then. Now let's check it out today. This is the population density of the United States in the year 2000. I just had to throw this in here because I think it's really interesting. Look at our previous map. The most dense area of population back in the 1800s, 90 people per square mile. Today, the pink is 1,000 people or more per square mile. And down in New York City, I think they need a new color because I am positive that there are areas in New York City where there are many more than 1,000 people per square mile, thousands of people per square mile. So only the areas of pink would be over 1,000 people today. But let's go down here. Anything that is in this light peach or orange or pink, so almost all of these areas have even more people than those tiny red dots on our previous map. So I think if you just take this and look at it for a couple minutes, you'll really appreciate how many more people are in the United States today than back in the 1800s. But On the other hand, if you go down to the greens, that's still zero 0.9 people per square mile. So if you don't like being around people, there are still places in America, and this is one thing I think that makes our country special, is there are still areas of wilderness. There are still places you can go where there aren't houses and telephone poles and even roads. You know, some of these areas out near in the Rocky Mountains are still largely wilderness. Even the lighter greens here, you're still talking between 1 and 9.9 people per square mile. Of course, some of this is desert and some of it's mountains, but it still makes America quite a special place. One thing that I know, I've talked to people who've been to Europe and European countries, and then they've come back to America, and they've made the remark, you know, one thing we don't appreciate here is how much land we have. You know, we have trees, we have forests, whereas in other parts of the world where they're very heavily populated, a lot of that stuff has been cut down. So I just think that's something that makes America special. I'm going to test you here, and we've been working on this all year long. I said since September that one of my goals for you this year would be to have you be able to find yourself on a map. Where do you live? Where is Rochester on this population density map? All right, let's wrap these notes up. We can see that the population of the U.S. is definitely increasing. In fact, by 1820, it's 2.5 times what it was. The wilderness east of the Mississippi River is starting to disappear, and the first new states are added, and they continue to be added until by 1821, we've grown from 13 states to 24 states. And now I'm going to have you look at 3 more documents, answer some questions. I think because the video is getting a little long here, what we'll do is have you try to answer the questions for these documents, and then I'm going to cut the video off. There's a purpose for these documents. It's going to lead into the next part of this lecture, but we'll wait to continue it until next week. So let's just go through the documents, have you go through the documents, answer the questions, then we'll wrap it up for the week. And next week, I'll tie this all together with what we're learning about America growing and Americans moving west. The first document, remember, pay attention to the title, A Network of Canals. We see a key, or sometimes called a legend. These little hatch mark, I don't know what to call it, hatch mark. It's like a line with little lines on it. Those are canals. Navigable river is in blue, so these are all rivers here. Navigable means it's a river that you can navigate on. You can actually move a boat along, because there are some rivers that are not navigable. They just are too shallow to actually use a boat on. So that's what navigable means. And we're using the political boundaries of 1850. So this is basically a map from 1850. Next document is a chart. The title is kind of hidden up here at the top. Chart comparing travel by dirt road and travel by the Erie Canal. And then all this other junk, which is just telling you where I stole this chart from. So we've got 2 methods of transportation: dirt road, canal. The actual method on the dirt road is wagon pulled by horses. The method of transportation on the canal is a line boat using mules. This term freight, I want to point that out. Freight means stuff. So if you're transporting things, you could transport people, that would be passengers, or you could transport goods. And goods would be things that you're like transporting to market, for example, and it's called freight. So freight is stuff as opposed to passengers, which is people. And of course, we also have the amount of time and the cost, which changes depending on the method. So take a look at this chart and please answer the questions. Next document is a simple bar graph, miles of railroad track in the U.S. And finally, I'm going to throw in a challenge here because I bet you've never seen a time map. And that's what this is, a time map. Because rate, in the context of these maps here, rate means a measure of time. So I'm not going to explain anything here. I'm just, like I said, I'm going to challenge you. Take a look at it. Do your best. Certainly an unusual map. Try your hardest to figure this out. And when you're done, you will be done for the week. Hope you guys have a good week, and I will see you next time.